Okay, everyone, is this on? Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I'm going to ask everybody to please take a seat. Okay. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to our annual Murray Pantirer Memorial Scholar Lecture. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Dr. Adara Goldberg. I am the Executive Director of the Holocaust Resource Center, the Council on Global Education and Citizenship, and the Human Rights Institute here at Kean University. And I'm really excited to be here with everyone this evening, all of you who are joining us in person, who despite all of the terrifying forecasts made it here today, and to our friends around the world who are joining us on Zoom. Let me take you back a few years. It was 2018. Me and our Director of Education, Sarah Kuykendall, took the helm of the Holocaust Resource Center with a very clear vision in mind. We wanted to grow a center that was already doing outstanding work, to take it from a regional level to an international level, and hopefully, we can one day see ourselves and our work and all of you in the stars. We wanted and continue to want to learn from the past to build a better future. Our work honors the legacy of Murray Pantirer of blessed memory, and of the other Holocaust survivors who founded the Holocaust Resource Foundation. This is a group of courageous men and women who had their own vision, and in partnership with Kean University, they established our center. This was a moral imperative for them, to build a space that was open to everybody, that did not discriminate based on race, religion, economics, where everybody could learn and engage in the most accessible manner possible. Today is our 8th year of running this lecture, and every time I stand before you, there's an affirmation, there's a recommitment from my end that I really believe in our founders' goals, and I appreciate the university's commitment to enabling us to continue doing this work. Our audience tonight reflects the reach and breadth of our work. I want to take a moment to recognize those of you who are in the room. And our friends on Zoom, you should feel free to stand when you are called in your own homes. The first thing I want to do is invite any Holocaust survivors or descendants of Holocaust survivors to just take a moment. We thank you for entrusting us with your history and your family's history, and continuing to show up to remind us why we do this every single day. So please, if you are here, stand up. Teachers, including the remarkable faculty in our post-baccalaureate certificate and our dual credit program, you are the backbone of what we do. We could not reach 20,000 plus people each year without you. So please stand. And students, you are the reason for the season. You provide us with a sense of purpose and hope for the future. Could you please stand? So I want to take a few minutes, and I do appreciate you listening. I think it's really important to acknowledge the people that are in the room and the people who make this work possible. I'd like to thank the Pantirer family for showing up year after year, no matter what the conditions are, to be here to share their family's legacy. Our Holocaust Resource Foundation, President Lamont Repillette, Felice Vasquez, Chancellor of International Campuses, Jessica Goldsmith-Barzilai, our Assistant VP of Global Initiatives, Sarah Kuykendall, our Education Director, Dr. Catherine Winter-Michaud, our Learning and Outreach Coordinator, and all of our students and part-time staff, including those who graduated, who showed up to be here tonight because they wanted to be part of this community. And this lecture really is important. It's important to us as a community, and it's important to me as a scholar and an educator. I take great pride, and I take it very personally, that I get to pick the scholars that we bring to campus. And I like to bring work that is of interest not only to me, but that I see as something that would resonate with our larger community. To be able to connect with people who do not otherwise feel like they have a connection. And so you'll be able to hear tonight from Dr. Rachel Deblinger, who 9 years ago I had the good fortune to study under at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. So it's a pleasure for me to honor her, to recognize Dr. Joanna Sleva, who was last year's Pantirer lecturer, and to again thank all of you, for being here. And now it is my privilege to introduce a mentor to me and a proponent of Holocaust education to everybody in this community, Felice Vasquez.
Thank you, Adara. I'm not going to take much time because you all came here for a very special lecture. We are very grateful to the Pantirer family for continually supporting this special lecture, and of course, President Repillette, who you'll hear from in a few minutes, who has been a staunch advocate for our continued work. So I'm just going to take a couple minutes to tell you some of the things that we've been doing that are the very reason why you're making the right choice to continue to connect with our Center for Holocaust Education, Human Rights Education, and our Council on Global Education. Since 1982, the Holocaust Resource Center at Kean University was established as a leader in the field of Holocaust education. Today, the Jewish Foundation for the Righteous recognizes this HRC as one of only 13 Holocaust centers of excellence in the country. Additionally, the HRC is a mentor for the community of Holocaust education centers at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and part of the consortium of higher education centers for Holocaust, genocide studies, and human rights. What started as a local resource hub has become a distinctive center where we teach others how to teach about the Holocaust around the world. The Holocaust Resource Center's Executive Director, Dr. Adara Goldberg, is a historian for the Canadian National Holocaust Monument Exhibit Renewal Project. She is also a published author and a featured historian for the Israeli Foundation Holocaust Survivor Memoirs Program, Seeking Refuge. The curriculum and the Montreal Holocaust Museum's virtual exhibition, Building New Lives. Sarah Kuykendall, who's our Managing Assistant Director of Education, was invited to join the 2024 Educators in Jewish College Campus program at Yad Vashem's International School for Holocaust Studies. She is currently a Rethinking Holocaust Education Fellow with the Ghetto Fighters House and the Auschwitz State Museum for the 2025-26 academic year. She is part of the consortium that is developing the curriculum that will teach the next generation of Holocaust educators how to teach the Holocaust best to tomorrow's students. This is a huge accomplishment, and it is part of what brings distinction to Kean University's Holocaust Resource Center. In 2024, Jessica Goldsmith-Barzilai, our Assistant Vice President for Global Initiatives, led Kean University's first ever Holocaust Education Travel Learn. It's Lessons from the Holocaust, which went to Poland to explore sites in the memory of her father, a Holocaust survivor. And one of our testimonies, our most recent testimonies, collected in our treasured home in the Holocaust Resource Center. There's another Lessons from the Holocaust Travel Learn scheduled for this year to Berlin. It's scheduled the applications remain open through December 8th, so if there's anyone here interested, please connect with any one of these Holocaust Resource Center scholars. Today is Giving Tuesday, so I invite everyone here tonight to recognize the critical work of the Holocaust Resource Center and consider giving what you can to support the continuation of this work and the students who benefit from it. Details for donating are available outside the auditorium doors. And now, it's my great pleasure to introduce the leader who allows all of our good work to continue to grow and serve the community, President Dr. Lamont Repollet.
Good evening, everyone. We can do better than that. That's our scholarship. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. All right, thank you, Felice and Dr. Goldberg, for your dedicated leadership of our Holocaust Resource Center and for the care that you and Sarah pour into this invaluable work. Tonight, we gather as a community grounded in memory, reflection, and responsibility. More than 4 decades, Holocaust survivors who settled here in Union County placed their trust in Kane University. Among them was Murray Pantirer, the sole survivor of his Polish-Jewish family and a member of Schindler's Jews. They believe that our community of educators and learners had the power to transform memory into meaning, testimony into truth, and history into hope. A respected leader in the community, Pantirer was a founding member and the first president of the Holocaust Resource Foundation, which helped establish the Holocaust Research Center here at Kane University. His work shaped and strengthened Holocaust education across the country, and his legacy continued to ground the center's mission: to collect history with care, to commemorate lives with respect, and to educate new generations with courage. This is especially important as we witness rising anti-Semitism throughout our nation and around the world. As New Jersey's Urban Research University committed to anchoring our communities, Kane has a mission to foster equity, inclusion, and public impact, leading us to create spaces where truth is upheld, empathy is taught, and students are empowered to defend human rights for all. When we stand together, we push back against the darkness. The Holocaust Resource Center embodies that work by using testimony to teach history, to ensure its weight is felt, and to remind us that silence is never neutral. Every voice matters. I had the profound experience last week of visiting the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam. Walking through the secret annex, the narrow stairways, the small rooms, the shadows that still hold memory, I felt the weight of her words come alive. Through her diary entries, I could see and feel the world she endured, the fear, the confinement, the flickers of hope she refused to relinquish. It was more than a tour. It was a reminder why our work here at Kane University matters. The visit for me was kind of life-changing. Living the embodiment of the mission of Kane's Holocaust Resource Center, we strive to take history out of abstraction and put into lived experiences, because it is only when we feel history that we begin to understand our responsibility to it. And through the generous support of the Holocaust Resource Foundation, our educators, faculty, and students are able to engage in these same powerful experiential learning opportunities. They can walk the paths of survivors, stand inside spaces where courage was tested, and see firsthand how memories shape moral action. Experiences like this bring life to the enduring words of another Polish-born Jewish leader, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Herschel, who marched with Dr. King and declared, "Speech has power. Words do not fade. What start out as a sound ends in a deed. You see, Anne Frank's words became a global call to conscience. Herschel's words became a rallying cry for justice, and Pantirer's life became a testament to survival and moral responsibility. Together, they remind us that our voices and our actions must stand firmly against anti-Semitism, hatred, and racial injustice in all of its forms. So tonight, we welcome author Rachel Deblinger to reflect on remembrance and responsibility. She will challenge us to consider how communities face difficult truths in real time and how the stories we tell shape our will to act. In that spirit, we recommit ourselves to a future shaped by rising leaders who stand against hatred, strengthened by remembrance, and guided towards justice. Thank you for all being here this evening. Your presence reflects a shared promise. We will continue the work entrusted to us by survivors like Murray Pantirer and their families to ensure these lessons are never lost, never diminished, and never forgotten. Thank you.
I would now like to introduce Danielle Auerbach, grandchild of Murray Pantirer, to give her remarks. Thank you.
Good evening, esteemed guests. As some of you may know, I am the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. My grandfather, Murray Pantirer, of blessed memory, was a Schindler Jew. He was saved from certain death by a righteous Gentile, Oskar Schindler, who risked his own life to save over 1,200 Jews on what has now become the famous Schindler's List. The sole survivor of his family of 9, my grandfather defied Hitler's dream to annihilate the Jewish race by marrying my beautiful grandmother, Lucy, of blessed memory, also a Holocaust survivor, and together having a family which is now, thank God, in its 4th generation. Despite the tragic losses they had endured, my grandparents, like many survivors of the Holocaust, started new lives after the war with hopes and dreams of a world without prejudice and hatred. They instilled in their children and grandchildren strong family values, a love of humanity, and the importance of giving back to the community. From a very young age, my siblings, cousins, and I were always impressed by the inner strength that maintained our grandparents' unwavering commitment to Holocaust remembrance and education. They believed with all of their hearts that they miraculously survived so that the 6 million innocent Jewish men, women, and children brutally murdered by the Nazis will never be forgotten. Throughout his life, through his great philanthropy, passion, and very frequent public speaking engagements, Murray was determined that Holocaust education was brought to the schools. He was invited to speak in front of U.S. presidents, senators, governors, foreign dignitaries, and people from all walks of life. Steven Spielberg asked my grandfather to be the keynote speaker at the Washington, D.C. premiere of the movie Schindler's List, where the president and Mrs. Clinton were present, many government officials, the star and cast of the movie, Holocaust survivors, and their families. As eloquently and passionately as my grandfather spoke on so many occasions, he always said his most important audiences were the teachers and students in the classroom. 1945 brought an end to the Holocaust, but tragically it did not bring an end to the hatred. 8 decades later, headlines are replete with worldwide racial, religious, and ethnic persecutions. There is a pervasive history of anti-Semitism in our educational system, politics, and pop culture, and it is getting worse every day. After October 7, 2023, when 1,200 innocent Israeli men, women, and children were brutally murdered, kidnapped, raped, and mutilated, violent anti-Semitic protests calling for globalizing the Intifada and destruction of the Jewish homeland were normalized. Swastikas and other insidious symbols and acts of hatred appeared all over our state of New Jersey and around the U.S., in schools, synagogues, and other Jewish institutions. The lessons of the Holocaust combating unchecked hatred are more important now than ever. Never again is now. On behalf of my entire family, I would like to thank the Holocaust Resource Center at Kean University for continuing my grandfather's legacy through this annual lecture series and helping fulfill his unwavering commitment to Holocaust remembrance and education. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Rachel Deblinger. Dr. Rachel Deblinger is an historian of the Holocaust and American Jewish life and the director of the Modern Endangered Archives program at the UCLA Library. Her first book, Saving Our Survivors: How American Jews Learned About the Holocaust, explores early post-war Holocaust narratives, media technology, and the efforts of American Jewish communal organizations to aid survivors in Europe. Dr. Deblinger also writes and speaks about Holocaust memory, digital archives, and post-custodial collecting. Tonight, Dr. Deblinger will discuss her new book, Saving Our Survivors: How American Jews Learned About the Holocaust. Drawing on previously unexamined archives and post-war cultural materials, Saving Our Survivors invites readers to explore how American Jews constructed meaning out of devastation and how humanitarian aid became intertwined with public memory. The book also raises larger questions about historical tragedies are narrated in moments of crisis and how stories influence the will to act. Dr. Deblinger's groundbreaking work uncovers how American Jewish communities first came to learn about and respond to the Holocaust through communal campaigns, radio broadcasts, speeches, short films, and urgent calls to action. Please help me welcome Dr. Rachel Deblinger.
Hi, everyone. That was a really wonderful welcome. I really want to thank Adara and the Pantirer family for having me here, and everybody at Kane. This is really an incredible opportunity. I loved getting to speak with the teachers earlier today, and I look forward to sharing some of my work with all of you and hearing your questions in a little bit. I grew up in northern New Jersey, and so this is particularly exciting for me to get to share this with all of you, and especially knowing that this work will impact how many of the teachers across the state get to teach their students and bring things back to them. And I also just want to thank all my family members who came today, because we're a New Jersey family. Okay, so Saving Our Survivors explores a broad range of post-war Holocaust representations. I look at Jewish communal organizations and other national and humanitarian organizations that shaped and disseminated images and stories about Holocaust survivors across a broad range of media materials to mobilize a humanitarian and philanthropic response at the end of World War II. The book and my work focuses specifically on the period 1945 to 1953, after which most of the displaced persons camps in Europe were closed and American Jewish communal aid largely shifted to work in Israel. The book illustrates how American Jews and their non-Jewish neighbors first encountered stories about Jewish survivors of Nazism during this liminal period, when American Jews responded to the changing boundaries of Jewish life, global politics of the emerging Cold War, and shifting cultural norms in post-war America. The work is animated by a set of questions. So I'm going to start kind of here. How did institutions and communal organizations that aided Jewish survivors craft narratives about the Holocaust? What kinds of stories did American Jews and their non-Jewish neighbors first encounter about the Holocaust? And more broadly, how have narratives about the Holocaust, particularly those expressed by or about survivors, changed over time? And I hope that this work helps us toggle between the specificity of the post-war period and a longer history of Holocaust memory in America. So on the one hand, I'm interested in the particular narratives shaped by the post-war period, this short transformational period of time around the world. But then I'm also interested in this much longer story, one that traces how knowledge about the Holocaust and its survivors have been, continue to be, and will be in the future crafted, mediated, and defined. I want to start in the post-war period, so again, kind of with our eye towards this longer history. But the title here, In a World Still Trembling, was the initial title of this work, and it comes from a letter that Gisela Wizanski and Lola Kramarski wrote to the Hadassah National Youth Aliyah Committee in July 27, 1945. They said, "In a world still trembling with the impact of evils let loose upon the world by our enemies and the enemies of mankind, let us be the ones to capture and save these young young survivors. And so I think it's really important when we start to think about what makes post-war memory unique from contemporary Holocaust narratives that we might be more familiar with, that the American Jews that were creating these narratives, that were circulating these narratives, they were also living in the world still trembling, right? They were also being confronted by this unprecedented evil and the narratives and images that were coming out of Europe. It's hard to paint a clear picture of what post-war Europe was like. Throughout this short period of time, the number of Jewish survivors ebbed and flowed. In the immediate aftermath of the war, so the spring and summer of 1945, roughly 10 million people were categorized as displaced persons, and you can see some of them here. Jews at the time made up only a small percentage of this group. As the liberating armies swept through Europe, both from the east and from the west, the vast majority of DPs were repatriated and found their way home. So by August 1945, so this is a really short period of time, only, still a very large number, 1.5 million DPs remained in the occupied territories as refugees. And by this point, a larger percentage of these overall DPs were Jewish because they refused to be repatriated to their homes from before the war. In the years ahead, the number of Jewish DPs actually increases as Jews who had survived the war in hiding or in the Soviet Union or further afield made their way back towards Western Europe, many of them infiltrating into the DP camps in order to find lost family, build community, or try to emigrate to the United States or to Israel. It's this evolving group of survivors that lived in displaced persons camps through 1953. They were seeking opportunities for emigration, not only to Palestine, then Israel, and the United States, but also to places like Canada, Australia, and beyond. And this group of survivors gave themselves the name the Sherit HaPlatah, the surviving remnant. And this group is really the first group of survivors that inform how American Jews became to understand the story of surviving Jews. So it wasn't only stories from Jews who had survived concentration camps, but also from Jews who had survived in hiding in the Soviet Union, Jews who had survived in Catholic homes or in pretending to be non-Jewish throughout Europe. And I'm starting with these details because it's important to note that the narratives that circulated in post-war Europe and post-war America were specific to the post-war period. They reflected life in DP camps, when surviving Jews in Europe waited for opportunities to rebuild their lives. So they're quite different than the survivor testimonies we would hear once survivors had come to the United States, once they had rebuilt their lives, once they had married or set up their families and their homes in the US or in Israel. These narratives were really reflective of this DP period in post-war Europe. And in fact, these narratives look and sound quite different than the narratives that we are more familiar with today. And I know it sounds like I'm really harping on this point, but it is kind of the starting point for thinking about post-war narratives and why they have often been left out of our memory and understanding of how the Holocaust has come to be part of a narrative in America. So if you can imagine in your head a survivor who has come to your school, or a testimony that you saw online, or maybe you've seen some of the new 360 holograms or an AI project, these narratives are all going to be quite different, and I encourage you to kind of start with an open mind, because post-war communal narratives were often not clear chronological narratives. They often did not focus on the details of one individual's experience. Instead, these narratives, the images and voices that were captured, shaped, and disseminated were meant to mobilize action and advocacy. They were not preserved or collected for preservation. They were not collected or preserved to kind of document what had happened. Instead, they were really meant to inspire the people that were receiving them towards fundraising, towards action and advocacy. Okay. So you can start to see some of the narratives here. So this is the image that was taken in Marseille of Jewish DPs leaving Europe in 1949. And this is how that image got circulated in post-war America as the image on the top of an annual report from the United Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. Right, so these are all survivors, but they don't look like what we might think of as a Holocaust survivor. They were kind of in pursuit of freedom after the war. Nonetheless, they are important to consider as part of the history of Holocaust memory in America, because they remind us that the Holocaust has taken on different meanings in American Jewish life over the past 8 decades, and that it will continue to do so today and into the future. So what do these narratives look like? Here's a little sneak peek of some of the materials circulating in the late 1940s. Materials were largely focused on the needs of the 1940s, so the food, material goods, all of the kinds of things that survivors needed in the immediate aftermath of the war. They also often featured or centered children, even though child survivors were actually a very small percentage of the overall survivors that remained in post-war Europe. They also invited American Jews into the narrative, calling on them to give help that could only come from America. And we're going to kind of explore those 3 themes together. We can see from we could see these ideas in this statement from Joseph Schwartz in 1945 that American Jews had to respond as never before. They were called on not only to help and support Jewish survivors, but to ensure that there was a Jewish future after the war. Schwartz was the head of the European activity for the Joint Distribution Committee and wrote to his American constituents in July 1945, quote, "Europe relief is not a charity anymore. It is a paramount responsibility of the American Jewish community, a common understanding of reconstruction and rehabilitation on which we must set no limit on effort or cost. Only with this approach will we be able to handle the problem in the constructive manner necessary to rebuild the broken Jewish communities in Europe." So one of the things just to highlight in the post-war period is that it is a really small margins. So we're looking at month to month. The kind of situation on the ground is changing. So thinking about going from 1945 to 1948 after the founding of Israel, these narratives are changing very quickly. But this idea that the American Jewish community must set no limit to aiding Jewish survivors kind of remains consistent. In 1945 into 1946, organizations like the United Jewish Appeal called on American Jews to donate at one-time only levels to meet this unprecedented need. The leaders of Jewish organizations were optimistic that the crisis of feeding and healing hundreds of thousands of Jewish survivors could be completed in 1 year. This was not the case. And communal leaders had to repeatedly ask for one-time level gifts throughout the entire post-war period. And American Jews met that demand. In 1946, UJA, which was the umbrella organization that raised funds for the JDC, the United Palestine and then the United Israel Committee, and the National Refugee Service, which became the United Service for New Americans. The names of these organizations are less important than understanding that the United Jewish Appeal raised money for Jewish aid in Europe, Jewish aid in Israel, and then Jewish aid for refugees to America. So it's kind of these 3 distinct geographic areas where Jewish aid was being directed. And the United Jewish Appeal raised money for all of them collectively. So to give you a sense of how ambitious, they set a goal of $100 million in 1946. To give you a sense of how ambitious this goal was, the United Jewish Appeal had raised $100 million throughout the entire war. So from 1938 to 1945, the United Jewish Appeal raised $100 million. In 1946, 1 year, the United Jewish Appeal aimed to raise the same amount, $100 million. At the same time, the Red Cross, an organization with membership of 18 million people in America, also set a goal of raising $100 million. Jewish community leaders themselves thought this goal was ridiculous, but not only did they meet it, they exceeded it, raising $103 million in 1946, and then in 1947, UJA again exceeded their fundraising goal, raising over $150,000. The totals remained over $100,000 for the next 5 years, hitting $200,000 at least in 1948, after the founding of Israel. These fundraising narratives explicitly pulled at the heartstrings of American Jewish donors, relying, as I mentioned, on stories and images of children, including campaigns that were specifically focused on children. So before I kind of move on to this child-centered narrative, I just want to highlight that the numbers here are less important in detail than they are at scale. So recognizing that American Jews were giving at an unprecedented level suggests that these narratives were in fact reaching the homes of most American Jews across the country. And when I first started doing this research, I got a lot of questions about but were people really seeing these and were people really reading these? And so these numbers aren't meant to say the numbers themselves are important. They're meant to say that American Jews were not only receiving these narratives, but responding to them as well. So what do the narratives look like? Well, this is some example, and as I mentioned, they were often focused on children. So you can see on the left side, our child survivors. This was a campaign from the United Jewish Appeal that focused specifically on Jewish orphans in post-war Europe and told stories of Jews who were brought into orphaned homes, meant to focus on, to provide support for these orphaned homes. You can also see across the top of the slide, there's 3 different kind of letters or like certificates. All of these were from child adoption programs that almost every Jewish organization at the time created some form of an adoption program where individuals or groups could be connected with an individual young survivor. They would write them letters, they would send them presents. The kind of early one, this one in the middle, the World Hanukkah Festival, the World Jewish Congress organized a Hanukkah fundraising where they collected gifts and tried to send a gift to every Jewish child survivor in post-war Europe, and they succeeded, and that led to the letter-writing campaign that followed through 1949. The emotional heft of the story and of these campaigns was not necessarily the tragedy of the individual experiences under Nazism. More consistently, it was the ongoing demand for safety, security, and survival. The immediate need for food, for clothes, for medicine, for books. And these campaigns invited American Jews to act as saviors, asked to provide aid, hope, love, all of which could only come from America. So we can see here American Jews were called on to literally serve as the lifeline for European Jews. This image is from a 1947 brochure for a program called Supplies for Overseas Survivors. Between 1947 and 1949, SOS collected 26 million pounds of relief goods from nearly 1,000 communities across the country. They sent 14 million pounds of food, 11 million pounds of clothes, 1 million pounds of medicine, and over 170,000 toys. So again, the numbers aren't so important. Again, it's like the scale of participation that really helps us understand that American Jews were paying attention and they were responding. The focus on material goods and on the role of America in providing aid echoed across the country. So earlier today, somebody asked me a question about how these Jewish narratives aligned with kind of contemporary politics at the time. In 1945, President Truman reported from the Potsdam Conference that ended the war that the U.S. must win the peace, and that if we let Europe go cold and hungry, we may lose some of the foundation of order on which the hope for worldwide peace must rest. And this same idea was echoed in the kind of mainstream journal, the Saturday Evening Post, that world relief is America's job. So again, the Jewish narratives were really echoing narratives that were circulating more broadly across America. The images that American Jews were encountering were not dissimilar to these other broader narratives, including newsreels that were airing before movies across America. And it was the sense that America's job was to donate these materials and money to feed and clothe not only kind of for American Jews, Jewish survivors, but also all war-torn children of the world. And so these are some narratives, or these are some images from 2 clothing drives that activated the entire country, the first in April 1944 and the second in January 1946. And so these kind of early Cold War narratives meant to send friendship abroad are very similar to the narratives that were circulating from the JDC and from the UJA, meant specifically to aid Jewish survivors. And I want to hold on to this idea that in this period, there was this connection between winning the peace and materiality in particular. The idea that it was the job of Americans and American Jews for specific programs, not only to preserve the future of Judaism, but to really provide clothing, material aid, again, that could only come from America. So before we kind of get back to that, there was another set of narratives at the same time, focused not on fundraising, but on immigration advocacy. And many of these narratives were coming from anti-Zionist or non-Zionist organizations at the time, while there were narratives that were focused on providing aid to Israel, and especially the kinds of Hadassah narratives, like these ones about the children. There were also non-Zionist organizations, Jewish organizations, that were focused on providing advocacy for immigration to the United States. So there's kind of a multiplicity of representation of Holocaust survivors. And this organization, the Citizens Committee on Displaced Persons, was created in 1946 by the American Jewish Committee and the American Council for Judaism to advocate for suspended immigration quotas and temporary legislation. They sent out brochures like this one here and sponsored numerous radio broadcasts, which we'll get back to. So they said, after the nightmare of Nazism and fascism, after the Holocaust of World War II, We owe it to ourselves and to the world to be the guardians of freedom and peace. We owe it to ourselves and to the world to take action in solving problems which threaten the peace. The leading problem today is that of the displaced person. So again, kind of focusing everyone's attention on the displaced persons, not because of their experiences under Nazism, because of their need for immigration pathways in the contemporary period. And I'd like to kind of include this in all of the talks that I give, because it's helpful to know that the term Holocaust was in fact in circulation by 1947. It was one of many terms that was used to talk about what Jews had experienced under Nazism. Note that it was a lowercase h, so it wasn't yet used to kind of convey the event the way we use it today, but it was a term that was in circulation, and there was already an understanding that Jews had experienced something unique under Nazism, which shouldn't come as a surprise. So the Citizens Committee and other organizations, so we see a few listed here, further tied these narratives together, this idea of freedom and peace, often calling DPs, displaced persons, delayed pilgrims. And it was not just the Citizens Committee that centered America in the narratives about survivors at this time. We see here images from the Statue of Liberty as an icon of freedom, the idea that Jewish survivors were the pilgrims in our time, from a brochure from the National Refugee Service, which was one of the UJA funding organizations. And we can see a number of radio broadcasts, all of which kind of work at the intersection of America as a land of promise, of peace, and of respite, and America as a land of plenty, as a site for where surviving Jews can come to find post-war respite and freedom. We can also see something similar in this 3-page spread from Life magazine in 1947. Under the title Orphans Clothed, Life magazine featured 2 images of 2 young Holocaust survivors, Irene Gutman and Charles Caro. They're right in the center here. Irene and Charles had been brought to New York by an organization called Rescue Children, which was an emergency organization from Vad Hatzalah, the Orthodox rabbis organization, for a 10-day publicity blitz. They were the guests of honor at an annual gala in New Jersey. They were the guests of President Truman in the White House, and they were photographed around New York City in a variety of posed scenarios, trying on new clothes, carrying stuffed animals, all while gazing up at skyscrapers, grabbing from a pile of white bread sandwiches. These images in Life were posed to focus on the joys of American life and to celebrate those who had sponsored the trip. The accompanying article included almost no details about their wartime experiences, noting only that both of Irene's parents were exterminated in a concentration camp. Charles's father was killed and his mother died of starvation. So we kind of get that one sentence of information, but the Life magazine does tell us that the sight of Irene and Charles at daily luncheons and parties has already touched so many hearts that donations to busybodies have jumped 30%. So again, these narratives were really focused on this fundraising urgency, more so than explaining what was happening to these children and what had happened to them, why they needed this help. The presence of Irene and Charles could spark participation in adoption programs and fundraising programs, again speaks to the importance of children as symbols of the Holocaust and the resonance of America as part of the Holocaust story. There's a lot more to tell about Irene and Charles, and if anyone is interested, I encourage you to ask during the Q&A because it's a really wonderful story. But I want to kind of turn to one final, kind of more in-depth example to highlight what I see as the most dominant themes from post-war Holocaust narratives and showcase some of the media formats that were used to disseminate these stories widely across the country. Between 1946 and 1948, the story of Kurt Meyer, that's not Kurt Meyer, we'll get back to that. So the story of Kurt Meyer was publicly shared at least 3 times that I have identified. These narratives reveal some of the themes I've already introduced: the central story of America, the need for American Jews and Americans to serve as saviors in the post-war, and advocacy for immigration reform, as well as a sense of optimism and freedom in America as a direct contrast to the experience of Nazism. On April 6, 1947, the United Service for New Americans sponsored a special Passover celebration that aired on the radio with the title Out of the Wilderness, which is a great Passover title. I think we should all start using it again. And the broadcast featured 5 survivors of Nazi oppression, including Kurt Meyer, who was a well-known Czech pianist at the time. He was also a survivor of Auschwitz, Sachsenhausen, Ohrdruf, and Buchenwald. The event's MC, David Timmons, welcomes Meyer to the stage, and I'm going to play 2 different clips from this radio broadcast. I encourage you to listen for two things. First, the accents. So listen for the difference between Timmins and Mayer. And then second, listen for what kind of information do we learn about the Holocaust. So what kind of story would the listening audience at the time have learned by hearing these radio broadcasts?
You've surely heard of our next guest. His story has been published far and wide in the United States by the same United Service that helped him to come to this country. His name is Kurt Meyer. Once his art was acclaimed, not only in his native land of Czechoslovakia, but throughout the world. Then the Nazis changed that world. The concert hall became the concentration camp, and the Nazis called upon Kurt Meyer to play when they shipped him to that terrible place called Auschwitz. Today, Mr. Meyer is here. He is the lone survivor of 86 persons in his family. Need we mention what his free, clean music means to him today?
So Timmins juxtaposes the freedom of America with the oppression of concentration camps to define America as a haven for Jewish survivors. Meyer then directly addresses the audience. I think it's important to kind of note that the narrator has an assumption that we as a listening audience know something, right? We understand that what Auschwitz is, right? There's some sense that knowledge has already been circulating, and we're not going to get it all from this radio broadcast. But then he invites Meyer to perform, and Meyer, I'm going to play a clip of Meyer performing My Yiddische Mama, a song. He plays it on piano. But before I do, I also want to note that he played two other songs as well, including Ich hab kein Heimatland, which is I have no homeland, at which he notes, quote, "We have sung it in the darkest hours in the various concentration camps." And he dedicates this performance for all of us who went through the Nazi terror. So in comparison to something like the Life magazine article, which included very little information, very little specificity, Mayer's doing some work to kind of help us focus on the people who lived through this experience.
Kurt Meyer now plays as part of his celebration of a free Passover in America, an arrangement of Yiddish folk songs and songs of freedom. Mr. Meyer.
There are thousands of people brought here by the United Service who, just as I, lost their mothers during the Nazi persecution. In memory, I want to play the old familiar song, My Yiddische Mama.
Post-war narratives, the ones that stand out the most to me in doing this research are the ones where the survivor is often trying to push against the kind of optimism that the American institutions or the American narrators are offering to them. So Timmins was offering a narrative of optimism, but Meyer was really pushing us to focus on loss. And I think that there's this interesting tension between the framework that survivors were given and the way they chose to kind of offer their own stories at the time. In Following Out of the Wilderness, Meyer's story was retold twice for American audiences. First in a 9-page New Yorker article titled Displaced, and then in a radio adaptation of that article, also titled Displaced. The article, written by Daniel Lang, detailed Meyer's life under Nazism from 1938 until his arrival in New York in 1946. Lang interviewed Meyer upon his 1946 immigration to the U.S. and framed his story as one of displacement and homecoming. The title, Displaced, suggests that this kind of broad narrative, and Lang's opening paragraph positions the article in favor of immigration reform. The article begins, One of the oratorical flourishes that almost every politician uses when addressing a group of foreign-born citizens is to hail America as the haven of the oppressed. He tells of the coming of the Pilgrims. In another year or so, the politician will be able to add a modern category, the DPs, or displaced persons. So Lang is clearly trying to add displaced persons, add Jewish survivors to the history of America, to this history of displacement and pilgrims, and haven. And we saw how organizations like the Citizens Committee kind of put this idea to work, referring to Jewish DPs as delayed pilgrims, transforming foreign and victimized survivors into Americans. Lang's article provided additional details of Mayer's experience under Nazism, published in print for national circulation. While Lang is using Mayer's story as representative of displacement, this is also an example of a detailed narrative. As readers, we could learn about Mayer's experience of deportation from one camp to another and the details of his experience not only as one of displacement, but as something closer to what we might consider to be a Holocaust testimony. Lang tracks Mayer from Carlsbad, or Karlovy Vary, Czechoslovakia, at the moment the Germans were awarded the Sudetenland and the Munich Accords, and Mayer fled to Prague and his deportation with his mother to Theresienstadt, where they lived for 2.5 years. There, Mayer's mother worked in the women's section, sewing uniforms for the Germans until she was deported to Auschwitz. Soon after, Mayer was also deported to Auschwitz, where he learned that his mother had been sent directly to the gas chambers. At Auschwitz, we learned through Lang's article that Mayer was assigned to the camp band, avoiding forced labor, but witnessing the lines of victims sent to the gas chambers. Lang quotes Mayer as saying, "The idea was for us to drown out their cries, but we never could." After 2 months at Auschwitz, Mayer was sent to Ohrdruf, a slave labor camp, where he worked on a V-2 launching site until he was again assigned to play music. In February 1945, Mayer was sent to Sachsenhausen, where he worked in an underground airplane factory. And a few weeks later, he was forced on a death march to Buchenwald, where, in April 1945, he was liberated by the Americans. Lang defined Mayer's Holocaust experience for readers of The New Yorker as a much more contemporary story of the Holocaust would be framed, a chronological progression from ghettos to camps to a death march, and one that ended in freedom in America. Again, a much more familiar story of the Holocaust survivor. In the following year, Lang's article was dramatized into a radio broadcast called Displaced. The radio broadcast was sponsored by the Citizens Committee, so again, focused on immigration to the United States and advocacy for immigration. Much like Lang's article, the radio drama framed the story around displacement and the need for immigration reform. But they also explicitly depicted a Jewish experience under Nazism. So in comparison to the radio broadcast I played earlier today, which was also sponsored by the Citizens Committee that didn't mention the Jewishness of the survivor at all, Lang's story and Mayer's story was explicitly about a Jewish experience under Nazism. So I'm gonna play some clips from Displaced as well. And let's listen for all of the themes that we've already identified, especially the place of America as a land of hope and opportunity. I'm going to start at the beginning of the radio broadcast, and you'll be able to hear, oh, sorry, I skipped the most important part here, which is that in this radio broadcast, in the drama, Mayer he doesn't perform as himself. Award-winning actor Paul Mooney is cast to play Mayer. So Paul Mooney was a very well-known actor at the time, well-known especially for his accents and for kind of like becoming his characters. He was also an Eastern European-born Jew, and at the time, so after the war, was a very fierce, very public advocate for all of these organizations. He was part of the campaigns for the UJA. He adopted many survivors under the children's campaigns. He recorded his own radio broadcasts, and then he, in this one, performed as Mayer. So as I play the clips, I invite you again to think about the accents, and also again to think about what we learn about Mayer, or what about Holocaust experience during the war.
Would you tell me, Mr. Meyer, about the first time you thought of coming to America?
Well, I suppose the idea could have begun with the snapshots and the postcards of Alice's. I recall back in 1938, I was playing the piano in Hotel Goldener Schild in Carlsbad. That used to be my hometown. I was born there.
You don't want this, do you? It is just an old postcard.
Oh, yes, I want it. I want to take it with me, Mickey.
But it is just a postcard.
I know. But it's for my sister in America. It's a picture of the Empire State Building.
So there's a couple of important things here. You might feel like that music was unexpected, and that is true. In this drama, the music signaled a jump in time. So the way that the broadcast was dramatized is that there was the present tense action at the dock where Mayer kind of came off the ship. He had not yet met his sister. It was his first kind of steps in New York, and he was interviewed by Lang. And then it flashes back to kind of show us, or show the listening audience, his Holocaust experience. And the music indicated these time jumps. And Mayer himself performed the music that was used in the radio broadcast. And this is really important because so many of the post-war narratives that I've seen in the archives have no record of consent. There were narratives about survivors, they were images of survivors, they were films of survivors. None of them knew about them. They did not have the opportunity to consent to them being captured or circulated. But we know that Mayer consented to be part of this story and to have his story circulated in this way. I'm going to play a second clip. And unlike so many other examples, again, Mayer's experience here is really specific and really detailed, but this second clip has a really significant change that jumps from the article into the radio broadcast. So in Lang's article, he writes that one day, when Mayer did not seem to be working fast enough, a guard wearing brass knuckles went to work on him and permanently scarred his chest. So this second scene I'm going to play for you transfers that scene into an audio genre, but importantly, it transfers this punishment from Mayer to the man next to him and makes a significant narrative change.
I was given a wheelbarrow and a pick and shovel and a lesson in what was expected of us by the poor fellow next to me. He faltered, and the guard rushed up.
You're there, get moving!
Please, I must rest for just a moment.
Get moving!
I can't. I try, but...
You are here to work. If you can't work, you are no use to us. So, you, over there, don't stand there staring at me. Get back to work! There. Now get to work! And all of you!
So hopefully you're already listening for the accents. There's some interesting accents chosen in that scene, and the music, which again kind of unexpectedly takes us out of this kind of serious moment. But the gunshot is surprising because there's no gunshot in the article. And so it's clearly a choice that was made for the radio broadcast, for an audio moment that would really kind of shock or kind of get listeners to pay attention. But I think it also helps remind us that these were used to get people's attention, right? That was precisely what these radio broadcasts were meant to do. And I argue that this change, this one small change, is an example of how Holocaust narratives in the late 1940s were not powerful because of their veracity. On the contrast, these narratives were meant not to document what happened, but to reveal the fear and danger of Mayer's experience. And we get that same idea through this more audio example. And they provoked the American listening audience to understand the terror and violence of Nazism. So to what end? The Citizens Committee and Paul Mooney took seriously the role of imparting a message of social concern. I'm going to play one final audio clip, and this is from the very end of the radio broadcast Displaced. At the end of the broadcast, Paul Mooney addressed the listening audience directly and called on individual Americans to help. So he speaks as himself. Again, you can notice like the shift in accent, no longer representing the victims, but the saviors.
Whether they live to breathe the air of freedom and health and happiness or sink into despair and death is for us to decide. The choice is ours. In making that choice, we cannot permit ourselves to forget the story in the oldest and wisest of books of the man who fell among the thieves and was left by the side of the road to perish, and of how there were those who passed by on the other side and took no notice until there came that way a certain Samaritan who stopped to bind the man's wounds and give him comfort and compassion. Ladies and gentlemen, That is our choice today, the way of the Samaritan or of those who passed by on the other side. It is for us to choose, remembering that for that choice we stand accountable to our conscience and to God.
By ending Displaced with Mooney's appeal, Kurt's story was explicitly put to the service of immigration advocacy. Mooney called on Americans to act based on a moral imperative rooted in the Christian tradition of neighborliness and selflessness. The experience of radio invited listening audiences, not just Jewish audiences, to feel the immediacy of this call as Kurt's story gave way to Mooney's appeal. I chose to share the multiple representations of Kurt Mayer's story today because it highlights so many of the themes explored in Saving Our Survivors. Primary among them, Kurt's story and its repeated telling challenges the belief that there were no Holocaust narratives in America in the post-war. In fact, Holocaust survivors, their voices, their narratives, their experiences were circulated widely in post-war America, in multiple forms of media for multiple audiences. Radio special, New Yorker article, radio drama. They were part of the media landscape at the time, and in mainstream American spaces like The New Yorker, and in more targeted materials for Jewish audiences like fundraising brochures. And yet, the idea remains that there was silence after the war. The sense that survivors did not share their stories publicly, that American Jews weren't listening, remains. Saving Our Survivors argues that the burst of expression of Holocaust narratives after the war is in many ways unfamiliar. But these narratives offer a starting point for understanding the development of Holocaust memory in America and a way for us to better see the gaps in collective engagement with the Holocaust. Transformations not only of the stories themselves, but in the technologies used to capture them and to circulate them, in the themes centered in narratives, and in particular in the role survivors played in crafting these narratives, moving from the periphery of these post-war narratives to the center of how we tell and understand the Holocaust today. Considering these narratives serves as a general reference point for all of us who have lost, for all of those who have lost their mothers, and for all of us who went through Nazi terror. But also, Kurt's story is a specific experience for himself, experiences in Carlsbad and Auschwitz and Buchenwald, and they remind us that these narratives are historically bound. We are reminded that the narratives we take in, whether they are those from testimony collections, movies, personal interactions with survivors, online videos, VR content, all of these new testimonial projects are also historically bound. They are created with the technologies available to institutions, and they are crafted with care and concern for the pressing issues of the day. They expand our understanding of the history of the Holocaust narrative creation and narrativization, and can help us better trace the messy, diffuse, and ongoing nature of narrative construction, both in the wake of each new tragedy we confront and in the long wake of remembering the Holocaust. Thank you. So we're going to switch to some questions, and I would love it if maybe some of the students wanted to start. And I see a lot of you over on this side, so I'm just going to totally put you all on the spot. Yeah, I see a hand right there. Wait, there's a microphone right here.
Wait, where's the hand? Oh, hi. Here you go. I wanted to ask more about Irene and Charles.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad I planted that seed. So Irene and Charles were featured in the Life magazine article. They were brought to the United States, and they were told that they would only be brought for this 10-day trip. And for Irene in particular, she wanted to go back to Europe. She had a friend that she was in the orphanage with. She wanted to go back because she wanted to immigrate to Israel. And what happened was that the organizers of Rescue Children decided that they couldn't possibly send these children back to the depravity of Europe after experiencing white bread and the wonder of New York City. So they found families to adopt them in the United States. Both Irene and Charles were adopted in the United States. Both of the families that adopted them found and brought over their siblings. But what we don't learn, and if you only read that Life magazine article, you would have no way of learning, was that Irene was a Mengele twin. She was separated from her mother at Auschwitz, and her twin brother were experimented on by Mengele in Auschwitz. And over the years, Irene became a really powerful speaker on her own. She spoke to schools. She lived in Long Island, so she spoke in schools on Long Island. She gave testimony at the U.S. Holocaust Museum many times, so several testimonies, one by herself, one with her twin brother. She created a documentary in the 2000s, so about 20 years ago, about her experience. And one of the things she talks about is how horrible the experience of being this kind of poster child was after the kind of trauma she'd experienced. And so I think there's something really, for me, about Irene's story that helps think about this long history. We can think about these like really beautiful poster children that helped raise the fundraising, right, for urgent need, but then actually overlooked all of the actual needs of this young person, who was then, over time, able to share her own story. Just to give like a little PS on that, last year, around this time last year, I had found Irene when I was working on my dissertation and reached out to her. And I was able to send her some news articles that she had never seen about her and Charles's experience. And then I was never able to find Charles. And then last year, I got an email from Charles's son-in-law saying that he found my dissertation online and he was so interested to learn that I had found all this information about Charles. In particular, Charles didn't like to talk about his experience, and his daughter and son-in-law didn't believe him when he said he met President Truman. So I got to send them the New York Times articles and say, no, he met President Truman. But then I got to Zoom with Charles, and Charles did not want to speak about his Holocaust experience at all. He wanted to tell me that he had become a professional tennis player, which I thought was amazing, and wanted to learn more, but his children kept redirecting the story back to the Holocaust because they wanted to learn more. It was this really interesting generational tension around how we tell these stories and who gets to tell them and what kind of information we get to share. Thank you. Thank you for that question. Any other questions from any students? Oh, yeah.
You talked about contradictions among different communities and different media and how the Holocaust was represented in early American memory. How did you decide which represented to foreground?
Oh, how did I decide which representations to foreground? Thank you for that question. So in the book, I divided it up by media type. So there's kind of a chapter about fundraising, brochures in particular, and there's a chapter about radio and sound, and there is a chapter about American aid workers who went to Europe and then they came back and they went on fundraising tours, and so their speeches. So I kind of organized it around the different kinds of media and material that I found from the time. But I would say that the ones that stood out that are featured in the book were largely representations that I could find multiple versions of them. So I was really interested in thinking about how these narratives change over time. So thinking about someone like Mayer, who there are these 3 different versions of his story. In the chapter about the American aid workers, I was able to find a rabbi who had served as a chaplain in Europe, and then 4 different versions of a speech he gave over 3 years in different fundraising events. So really trying to think about how do these narratives change even in this small period of time. The representations that I highlight in the talk are ones that I think are easy to see and understand pretty quickly and don't need as much description and explanation, but often that serve as representative for other kinds of narratives that were circulating at the time. It's a great question. Okay, if anybody is, yeah, there's also if anybody wants to come over here, but if you want to stand up and kind of talk loudly, maybe we can, I can relay your question too.
Do you think there's any motivation behind the American resistance to all the survivors beyond pure kindness?
Oh, that's a great question. So for everyone who's in here, what were the motivations beyond just pure kindness to the kind of action that was happening here? So there was some scholarly work done before mine on this time period, not a lot, but some. And one of the main arguments is that American Jews were motivated primarily by guilt. That they, after the war, when these narratives finally came out, when stories from survivors were circulating, when the newsreel started to circulate, American Jews realized how bad things were, and they felt so guilty they didn't save more Jews during the war, and then they kind of responded in this way. I'm somewhat convinced by that argument. I think that guilt was a big part of what was happening. But I think it was more than that because, again, as I mentioned, the fundraising during the war wasn't great, and there were already narratives circulating at that time. And so what I think was happening in the post-war was not only kindness, not only guilt, but also the opportunity to actually make a difference. So during the war, even these organizations that were trying weren't able to get to the Jews who were most suffering. They weren't able to provide aid. They were kind of working out of like Portugal and Switzerland, like in doing whatever they could. But once the post-war came, there was so much need, and American Jews were actually able to respond. So I think it's a combination of personal connections. People were trying to aid their families in Europe. They felt guilty about what they couldn't do during the war. And I think there was a really strong professional fundraising network that was circulating these narratives and organizing aid in a way that everyone felt they could participate. So I think there's a lot of things going on. Thank you. Okay, and yes, I think maybe you could come up to the microphone right here so everybody can hear you. Oh, great, thank you.
Very loudly. Thank you for coming, Dr. I'm a child of the baby boomer generation. Okay, in 1959, yours book came out. I would like to know how he got. It seems that he whitewashed the Holocaust, even though part of the book is about Doug Landau portrayed in the movie, but with the same name by Salaminio. What's your opinion of that book, Exodus, where he mentions Auschwitz, but he doesn't use the word Holocaust?
Well, as I mentioned, there were a lot of words that were used in the post-war period to kind of reference what had happened to Jews under Nazism. Holocaust was not the only term in circulation at the time, and definitely wasn't a kind of like definitive capital H term until 1978 or 1979. So I wouldn't have expected a book that came out in 1959 to kind of center the term Holocaust because it wasn't used in that way at the time. I'm not a scholar of the Exodus, the book, but I think like any narrative, right, it is focusing on a story it wants to tell and likely was using references to Auschwitz to reference the broader knowledge that people had at that time. So much like a lot of the narratives, so Mayer's story in particular, but they reference Auschwitz because news and images and there was so much coming out in the post-war period about Auschwitz. People knew what it was, and they used that as a reference to speak to a broader experience. So I don't think in order for 1959 audiences to understand what he was talking about, they wouldn't have needed a kind of big capital H Holocaust. They would have understood what he meant because it was circulating at the time. Any other questions? Hi.
I'm Claudia Hirsch. How do you do?
Hi.
Hi. I'm the daughter and granddaughter of survivors. You mentioned a little bit about the news and images coming out, but how much did American Jews learn about the Holocaust from what we now call mainstream media, the New York Times, and the many, many other broadsheets that were then around in America? How frank was the information?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the narratives that were in the kind of mainstream newspapers weren't like holistic, the way we would think about a holistic story today, right? If we read a history about the Holocaust, they were kind of like day to day. So there were stories when liberators would go into a concentration camp and there would be a story about like the camp that the army liberated. I think that a much more dominant source of information for Americans broadly at that time was through newsreels. So the Army had filmmakers tied to the Army, the groups that were liberating all of the concentration camps. They were capturing film, they were editing them, and they were creating newsreels that were aired before every movie across America in 1945 and 1946. Those newsreels were ubiquitous. And they had images of concentration camp survivors, of the gates and the like all the kinds of images that we would think of today as being representative of the Holocaust, they were in those newsreels. So a lot of the kind of communal narratives that American Jews were getting we're referencing from this information that was already widely in circulation. But I would say the other source of information that American Jews had that others didn't maybe was from sons and rabbis who were serving in the army or serving as chaplains. They were writing home to their congregations. They were writing home to their families. And the rabbis in particular, they were writing these letters home, and they were printed in their, synagogue circulars. And so there were these descriptions of what the liberating army was finding, specifically from a Jewish lens, that was circulating through Jewish communities in lots of different ways, especially through synagogues and rabbis. Yeah. Yeah.
I was wondering if there was resources offered to victims of the Holocaust who were not Jewish, because the Nazis, obviously, majority of their victims were Jewish, but they also targeted LGBT folk and disabled folk. And I was just curious if there were any efforts to help those people as well, or if there was any, if there was even a number of them that survived that could get resources. Was that a population? And if so, did they get help?
Yeah, thanks so much. So in the immediate post-war, again, that really short period, the summer of 1945, those 10 million displaced persons were not only kind of the groups you've identified were early targets of Nazism. So many of them did not survive. So LGBTQ, disabled people, the vast majority of them did not survive because they were targeted even before we think of the onset of the Holocaust. But for people who were displaced, brought from Russia, millions and millions of laborers were displaced by the Nazis during the war. They were put into concentration camps, into labor camps. They were largely repatriated after the war because they hadn't lost their citizenship the way Jews had. So there was a categorical difference. For disabled Jews, it's a really interesting story, and there is a new book that will be coming out at some point. But I mentioned at the very beginning that my book went through 1953 because that was when most of the displaced persons camps closed. But actually there were a number of displaced persons camps that were open from 1953 to 1956, specifically for disabled Jews because they were not able to emigrate either to the United States or to Israel. And so there's a particular history around aid that went to disabled Jews. And I'd have to ask my colleagues, but there might have been non-Jews in that as well. Yeah.
You started to address the first question a few minutes ago, but I'll ask it in a related one. If the book were called How Americans Learned About the Holocaust, how different would the structure of your book be? What would be some differences? And the other question is, how do American Jews learn about the Holocaust? How does that differ from how do Jews in other countries learn about the Holocaust?
Yeah, great. I'm going to start with the second part first because it's an easier one to answer. So a lot of the organizations that were creating these narratives for American Jews were global institutions, right? So the UJA had a Canadian branch and they had an Australian branch. And so the New York Center would kind of create these narratives and they would send them for use around the world, including many of these organizations would create an annual fundraising film. And then the film would circulate. There's letters in the archive of demands from the displaced persons camp for these films. So there's this interesting circulation network of these narratives. At one point, maybe Adara would even remember this better than I would, but at the U.S. Holocaust Museum in their film archive, they have a couple different versions of one of the fundraising films from JDC, including the Canadian version. And there's an extra postscript at the end. And it's so great because they make it very Canadian. They're our community isn't as big as the United States community, but it's still our responsibility to contribute. But they had smaller kind of goals. But these narratives did circulate, and including the American Jews who went to Europe as aid workers or as the tours that they went on, these fundraising tours, many of them went all across Latin America, across the Caribbean. These were kind of vast global networks that were working across Jewish communities. So I would say that one wouldn't be too different other than just the scale. In terms of how Americans learned about the Holocaust, I would say that they learned about Nazi oppression more than they learned about like Jewish experience under Nazism, because there was a lot of discourse about, you know, Nazi crimes, Nazi violence, especially by the time we get to the Nuremberg trials. There's a lot of focus in America about that kind of like the crimes of Nazism. There was less focus on the Jewish element of them, although there were some, like there were movies that came out in the 1951, 52, 53. There were short films about Jewish survivors and about Jewish DPs that were up for Academy Awards. So there wasn't nothing. Like there were narratives circulating, but I would say there was a broader narrative about Nazi crimes than there was about like Jewish victims of Nazi crimes.
You talk, I believe it's chapter 3 in your book, about some of the donations that were made to displaced peoples, like fur coats and tuxedos and things like that. How do you think that shows a gap in like a fundamental understanding of the Holocaust amongst American Jews?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So it's like one of my favorite finds in the archive. There is this like series of letters of complaints from one of the offices, the JDC office in Belgium, I like remember it very distinctly, saying that SOS, the Supplies for Overseas Survivors, had sent a package of fur coats and they weren't sure what to do with them. And the people were really mad about it. And there was like another set of letters that the offices in Europe were complaining that the clothes that were donated by American Jews had too many holes in them, they were too old. Like a whole other story we could talk about, but they weren't useful. So there were a couple of things that happened. One is that organizations like ORT still exists. Anyone know what ORT is? It's like training, skills training. And they set up workshops that would train people to repair the used clothes. So they thought there was like this added learning benefit. But the scale was just too great. And so what happened was the Jewish organizations started, instead of asking people to donate clothes, they started working with store owners to collect new clothes at scale. And then they started distributing those. But there was still this kind of problem of like, what do we do with these like tuxedos and what do we do with these fur coats? And one of the things that I think is really curious is that there's clearly, and the leaders of these organizations and the representatives of the organizations said outright in the letters, like there is a lack of awareness of what we are actually doing here and why we are actually collecting these clothes. But I think that criticism overlooks the like good intention of people who donated them, right? So if you had a fur coat at home and you were called upon to donate to someone who'd lost everything, like it's a little, like there's something nice about that person saying like, oh, this is what I have and I'm gonna donate this. In the book, for everyone who hasn't read it, I actually like pair that story with the story of Irene, same Irene from the Life magazine. In her testimony to the U.S. Holocaust Museum, she talks about remembering getting shoes in the orphanage that they were at. There was a donation of shoes that had come in, and all the kids had to try on these shoes, and she remembers seeing a pair of white sandals in the pile. And they were like gleaming white. And she was like, I wanted those white shoes. And she got those white shoes. And she's telling this story in the testimony. And you can see on her face that she's like remembering her like young self. It's like this really lovely story. And the next day they were going on a tour of Paris. And her feet started bleeding because those white shoes did not fit. And the leaders of this orphanage were like, why did you pick these white shoes? Like, they don't fit. And she was like, I wanted the nice shoes. And she says, like, in the testimony, like, the punchline of the white shoe story is that the leaders of this organization had to take her to a store to get new shoes, and she got to pick out red shoes. And it is, like, ingrained in her memory as this first moment of joy after the war. And so I think about that story of the red shoes paired with this story of the complaint around the fur coats, because yeah, they didn't need fur coats, but they needed clothes and they needed coats and they needed some joy. So I don't know, I think it offers us a way to like think about the layered meaning of material aid at that time. I think we have one question over here. Yes.
Yeah, so this is how American Jews learned about the Holocaust?
Yeah.
So this is how American Jews learned about the Holocaust. But as we now shift from this method, as firsthand accounts are you're no longer seeing as many survivors in classrooms.
Yeah.
How is this shifting now as we prepare to teach this next generation about Holocaust survivors and the acts that occurred?
Well, I think there's a lot of opportunity, right? There's thousands and thousands of recorded testimonies that are available to use. There are projects by organizations like the Shoah Foundation to create new opportunities for engaging and connecting students with survivors in their accounts and their memories. And I think it's also an opportunity for us to really think about what do we mean when we teach students about the Holocaust, and what are other resources we have to introduce them to this history. So, these radio broadcasts that I played for you, they're not survivor voices, really. They are a little bit. But I think there's so many sources. There's really no shortage of archival sources. There's no shortage of information. And so I think there's an opportunity for all of us who are engaged in Holocaust education and Holocaust memory to really think about what does Holocaust education look like now? Because it didn't always rely on survivor voices. And so there's an opportunity for us to use the resources we have and to think about what do students get out of that interaction, that we can find other ways to think about how else can we talk about these kinds of histories, and to really kind of take seriously the opportunity and the urgency around finding new ways forward.
We have time for one more question.
Everyone's done.
I have one more that I can ask to close us off. You mentioned, not briefly, but you don't go into a huge amount of detail on how gender impacted your analysis. I know you talk about gender in terms of Jewish women being called on to donate certain goods, but was gender a factor in how DP's experiences were conveyed? Was that invoked at any point?
Kira, were you like editor number 2 on my book? Because that question got asked a lot. So it's really hard to tell, honestly, because so many of these narratives, it's not clear why certain survivors were highlighted and certain survivors weren't. So it's not like there was like a clear description of we're going to feature men survivors or we're going to feature women survivors. I will say the one place where gender features really prominently is that in the 1940s, social work was kind of booming as an opportunity for American Jewish women in particular. They were the leaders, they were the founders of this field, and many of them were going overseas and going to Europe to work in DP camps, using their like new social work degrees to work and contribute to aid survivors. And so there's a very gendered aspect to the care work that was happening in post-war Europe, more so than I think the experience of the survivors in the aftermath of the war. Okay, thank you all so much.